After 3 months with this horrible situation, non-stop bombing, they allowed one airplane to evacuate the Yemenis.
This, of course, relates to Bahrain because people in Bahrain feel like if there were to be attacks by ISIS in Bahrain, there will be no protection from the government for the people.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on over 30 cable stations from Vermont to New York City. On the internet at thestruggle.org. Our YouTube channel, Struggle Video Media. The Middle East North Africa Solidarity Network US held a forum at NYU that featured talks about Yemen and Bahrain. The first speaker was Bushra al-Fusail, who's an independent Yemeni photographer and organizer of the 2015 Bike for Yemen protest against the war.
My name is Bushra, as I have been introduced. I'm a photographer. Mainly I talk about women's rights in Yemen. And I have done exhibition mostly about women's rights in Yemen. So I came here to talk about the war in Yemen that started at the 26th of March 2015. So far, it didn't end. I still remember that day as it's yesterday. It was the night of the 26th of March. We were just sleeping. We didn't know, or we didn't expect it, or I don't know how to describe it more. But everybody was sleeping. It was 12 a.m. and suddenly we started to hear bombing. Somehow we're used to it, but that was different because we felt it from the ground. We wake up, electricity was off, we didn't know what's happening. We started to call each other, the friends, the family, and then we finally know that it's Saudi Arabia is bombing Sana'a. It's just Sana'a that night. That night when we were still alive, we didn't sleep. We were just hiding under the stairs. We were happy that we were still alive that day. And then they said, the Saudi government, they announced it's just going to be for 2 weeks to destroy all the weapons for the Houthis and Ali Abdullah Saleh. And we were like, okay, though we didn't understand. At the beginning they were saying we're just gonna hit the military places, the storage for the weapons, and that's it. That 2 weeks, it was, yeah, for real. It was just the military places, which was far from the capital. So we were like, okay, we're gonna suck it for 2 weeks and we're gonna survive that. Though we didn't understand why Saudi Arabia or the Gulf were bombing Yemen. Why did they have to enter Yemen? 2 weeks finished, they announced that they're gonna have the Hope Storm. As in Arabic, they call it Asfat al-Amal. That they're gonna stop bombing and they're gonna just fix whatever they destroyed. But apparently after that day, it was much worse, the bombing. They started to bomb the schools, civil places, the streets, mosques, hospitals, and it happened all over Yemen. It's not just Sana'a. I don't know how how to explain the feeling living under airstrikes. I don't know how is it. They cut the electricity, no electricity at all, not even 1 hour, no water. The airport was closed, even if Yemeni people wanted to run away, but we couldn't because the airport is closed by Saudi Arabia. The border is closed. We can't go. We can't run anywhere. We were just forced to live that experience. After 3 months with this horrible situation, non-stop bombing, they allowed one airplane to evacuate the Yemenis, which is Yemeni Airlines. So how did they do it? Okay, so we have to send our names to the government, to the Saudi government, to allow us to go out of Yemen. Which is, this too we didn't understand, but we were so tired from living under the airstrikes without electricity, without water, without anything. After 10 days, they approved our names, me and my mother. And then we have been stopped in Bishan, Saudi Arabia for 5 hours. And we didn't understand that as well. It's just these police officers, they come inside the plane and check our passport for 5 hours, check our luggage. Different people comes in and out. And then we arrived to Jordan because that's the only place we could go. We go there and I thought that everybody gonna talk about the war in Yemen. I thought that anybody gonna know that I'm from Yemen, they're gonna have solidarity with me, or we feel sorry, or I don't know. I thought they knew about it, at least. But I just went there. They're like, oh, why did you go out of Yemen? I was like, good question. Well, there's a war. They didn't know. Jordanians, there is a war in Yemen. It's not one person I met. Didn't know. They don't know. There's, like, I was shocked. And then I went to Europe. Of course, it's the same. And nobody cares about or talks about Yemen. Till now, it's a horrible situation, and nobody talks about it. And this city where I grew up is where I studied, is all my memories there, and I'm just one simple example. And at that 3 months that I experienced the war, we had 5 days of truce. And everybody was just out in the street. And we felt like it's a carnival in Yemen in that 5 days. Everybody just walking. And that's when I did the bike campaign, that because we didn't have any petrol, that women could start bike and continue their life. And that's a resistance for the war, against the war. I have this interview with a journalist. He was asking me, so Yemeni woman likes to bike? I was like, yes, but it's a resistance to the war because we didn't have any petrol in the country. It's a resistance to the war they're doing this movement. And there's other people that are doing short movies and trying to prove they're still alive, and they resist what's happening in Yemen. Just a sign that people could talk about them or know what they're doing, because it's 10 countries against one country, which still we don't know what's going on. Why do Yemeni people have to experience this in the name of killing the Houthis or destroying their weapons? So, yeah. But still, there's a lot of resistance so far, especially with the youth. They're still doing. I love this project that they did. They collected the shattered glasses from the streets, and they just did it on the wall and painting all over the streets. It's a beautiful thing that they did, and it's simple. And there's people, they're just singing in the street, which never existed in Yemen. Small band, they just wanna, cheer up the streets in Yemen instead of the airstrikes sounds. And at the end of the days, I don't know, they're just strong people, they're trying to resist the war. And I hope that I could go back to my country as well soon without any airstrikes.
As we mentioned a couple weeks ago, Connecticut Senator Chris Murphy is calling for an end of U.S. weapons sales to Saudi Arabia, primarily because of their Yemen war. We join with Promoting Enduring Peace in supporting this stand. See the press release to that effect on our websites. Bushra al-Fusail was followed by Maryam al-Khawaja. She's co-director of the Gulf Center for Human Rights, located on the island of Bahrain. Bahrain is an absolute monarchy that several years ago suppressed its democracy movement with help from tanks from Saudi Arabia. Al-Khawaja's father is in prison with a life sentence, and her sister is often imprisoned. Maryam very bravely continues on.
First of all, let me say that it's always very difficult to follow a talk that is so personal, but I'll try my best. I'd like to start by thanking the Solidarity Network for organizing this event. He asked us at the beginning of the event if we would like to speak at the podium, and I told him I always have a problem because people can't see me above the podium, so I prefer to be sitting on the table. So this definitely helps. What I wanted to talk about with you today is, first of all, Bahrain, because of course that's the place where I'm from, and it's also the place that I've been working on the most for the past 5 years. But as was mentioned in the introduction, the Gulf Center, which I co-direct, actually covers 10 different countries, which is all of the 6 GCC countries, plus Iraq, Iran, Syria, and Yemen. And so I also wanted to reflect a little bit about the impact that the human rights situation in places like the GCC actually have on other countries in the region, and also the issue of international impunity that the GCC enjoys, unfortunately, today. To begin with Bahrain, what we saw, of course, in the beginning in 2011 was a knee-jerk reaction by the government to the protest movement. A protest movement that was peaceful and during which people were demanding basic rights and dignity and freedom. What we've seen since then is the government very successfully institutionalized the crackdown. What this means is that the main tool being used today to go after dissidents and to silence dissidents is the judiciary. The judiciary is run by the king's cousin. Most of the important ministers in the government today are members of the ruling family. And this means that they have complete control not only economically but also politically over the country. The way I like to describe it usually is that they run the country like a family business. It's a poorly run family business, but definitely a family business. And right now, Bahrain has a population of about 600, 700,000 people of citizens. And at any given time, you will find between 3,000 to 4,000 political prisoners in the prison system. This makes, according to a study that is done on prisons by a research center in the UK, Bahrain actually per capita has the largest amount of political prisoners in the region. What we see, of course, is this very specific system and process that is used. We're still seeing, as was mentioned in the Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry in 2011, that was fully accepted by the king, and supposedly that they were supposed to also implement the different recommendations that were made in the report. The process starts with usually house raids in the middle of the night. So anytime between midnight and 4 a.m. or 5 a.m. in the morning, civilian clothed police will break into people's homes, take people out of their beds, usually beat them, and then take them to the CID, which is the Criminal Investigation Department. During their stay at the Criminal Investigation Department, that's when they are usually subjected to enforced disappearance. And this could be anything from hours to days to weeks, depending on how long they need to torture or mistreat them to get them to sign confessions extracted under torture. After that, they show up in one of the prisons. We have 2 prisons, Dry Docks and Joe Prison. And then they are subjected to an unfair trial with lack of due process, after which they are then sentenced. And we've seen a correlation between the international attention about the situation on the ground and the impact on the human rights situation inside Bahrain. And so 2015, for example, we witnessed how there was less international attention on the situation in Bahrain, and how during 2015 there was a spike in the use of the death penalty against political prisoners. We also saw a spike in the number of arbitrary arrests that were occurring per week. And we also saw an increase in the use of, or the clampdown on public space. And so what we've seen since 2015 is also complete control by the government over public space to make sure that people can't protest on the main streets. What's important about Bahrain is that it also reflects on the situation regionally. Because in Bahrain we have something that it looks very similar to the situation in Iraq pre-ISIS. We have a military and police that are made up of one sect and one ideology, which is the Wahhabi ideology, which is a similar ideology to that of ISIS. We've already seen 4 members of the military in Bahrain defecting to ISIS, to go join ISIS. The person who is regarded as being second in charge in ISIS under al-Baghdadi is also a Bahraini. His name is Turki bin Ali. And so we see that there is actually a huge relation between how things play out in Bahrain and also their impact regionally. What is very problematic is that, you know, there's this quote that I really like that says, those who do not study history are doomed to repeat it, and those who do study history are doomed to stand aside and watch others repeat it. And I think that that's exactly what happens to us. You know, we see the mistakes that have happened in the past. We see how the United States, for example, said the right thing about Iraq, but they said it too late. They said that Maliki sectarian policies is what helped create a platform for ISIS in the region, in Iraq. And unfortunately, despite seeing the exact same situation playing out in Bahrain, they refuse to acknowledge that it's the same, to acknowledge that they need to make a public statement on that now before it's too late. Despite, of course, our consistent meetings with them and attempting to get them to do that. What's important also about Bahrain is that due to the lack of any kind of basic freedoms like freedom of expression, freedom of assembly and association, basically any space for people to gather or to express their anger and their opinions or criticism of the government, that along with the security situation regionally and the fact that ISIS has already made several threats of attacks in Bahrain, and they've already conducted suicide bombings in places like the Eastern Province in Saudi Arabia, which is very close to Bahrain and impacts the situation in Bahrain, but also the attacks that have happened in Kuwait. This, of course, relates to Bahrain because people in Bahrain feel like if there were to be attacks by ISIS in Bahrain, there will be no protection from the government for the people, given that the people in Bahrain are already targets of their own government. So you can imagine that the lack of any kind of space for basic freedoms, plus the regional security situation and the threats coming from ISIS, turns Bahrain into a powder keg. What this means is that we're currently at a situation right now where we have a window of opportunity where the Bahraini government can actually be pressured into doing the right thing. And Bahrain is one of the only countries in the region that actually has the capacity and the capability to become another quote-unquote success story of the Arab Spring. Not many other countries have that. But if Bahrain is not pushed to do the right thing, if the Al-Khalifas in Bahrain are not pushed to reform, if they're not pushed to conduct any sort of accountability, then we're going to see Bahrain, unfortunately, turn into a situation of violence as we have seen with other countries in the region. Now, when we're talking about, you know, the impact of the situation in Bahrain, but also the impact of the security situation regionally, we see how the Bahrainis, for example, because they enjoy international impunity, it means that they also enjoy, there's a culture of national or local impunity as well. And these two things feed off of each other. And this is something that we've been saying for 5 years to all of the different governments we've been meeting with, that we will only see local accountability in places like Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Oman, Qatar, Kuwait, wherever it is, when there is international accountability. The problem isn't that the GCC countries believe they can get away with anything. The problem is that they're right about it. The problem is that they conduct violation after violation and war crime after war crime, and there is no accountability. And I think the best example of that we've seen is when the Netherlands tabled a resolution at the UN calling for an investigation and accountability for war crimes for all parties in the Yemen conflict. And Saudi Arabia, backed by the United States and the United Kingdom, was able to get the Netherlands to withdraw that resolution, only to then table their own resolution, which basically said that the Saudi-backed Yemeni government would conduct their own investigation that would not be followed by any type of accountability. And when any country can have that kind of impact on the UN level, the Human Rights Council, which was set up to protect human rights, when a country is able to go and impact the Human Rights Council for there to be no respect for human rights or accountability, that is the state that we're in right now when it comes to the GCC and their level of impunity internationally. And this is where the problem lies. Now, generally, when we've talked to different governments like the United States government and the UK, we also try to explain to them that their credibility issues in the GCC impact their ability to have any kind of influence in other countries as well. When the United States tries to get involved in places like Iraq and Syria, it's not, people there understand that the United States does things based on personal benefits, which means they see how the United States supports countries like Saudi Arabia in committing war crimes in a place like Yemen, and at the same time is talking about the issue of war crimes in places like Iraq and Syria. And the thing is, you can't have those kind of double standards and consider yourself as a credible player in any situation anywhere in the world. If you're going to be one of the other shifts that we're seeing that I think is also very concerning is the shift, especially in Europe right now, because of the refugee crisis. We're seeing different countries in the West starting to shift their support and their position on supporting civil society and human rights defenders into a position of supporting or putting more support and funding into humanitarian aid and into fighting extremism and radicalization. It's problematic on many different levels. Of course, it's very important for there to be support in humanitarian aid. That's not something that we would argue at any time of any day. What we do argue, though, is that if you want to fight radicalization and extremism, the best way to do that is to support the human rights defenders and the civil society who are on the ground and at the front lines of fighting extremism and radicalization. Because those are people who are risking their lives on a daily basis to make sure that their country doesn't fall into chaos. And when countries like the GCC or others are able to silence human rights defenders and civil society by putting them in prison or by threatening them, and there's no support coming from anywhere, then we're going to see a situation where there is more radicalization and there is more extremism within these societies. And so the issue of supporting human rights defenders and civil society should always be at the forefront of any efforts to fight extremism or terrorism or radicalization. Finally, just to kind of round up, which is always difficult to do when talking about the GCC, I think that, you know, from here on out, what we're looking at is, I usually try to be optimistic in my talk, so it seems to be more and more difficult with every year that passes. We're looking at a situation right now where, given my experience in doing advocacy, especially in the West for the past 5 years, I don't think we're going to see a shift in the foreign policies, unfortunately, of countries like the United States and the United Kingdom. Instead of accountability and respect for human rights, we saw the United Kingdom announcing that they're opening their first Near East base since the 1970s in Bahrain. This was basically regarded by the Bahraini government as a reward. And we're seeing different countries like the US, like France, like Germany, like Sweden, like others, selling arms to places like Bahrain, like Saudi Arabia, and so on. And so I don't think that we are going to see politicians suddenly waking up one day and saying, well, we made mistakes, let's learn from them. But I think, like I said, we're doomed to sit by and watch them repeat those very same mistakes in the very same region where they committed the same mistakes before. What we can do, though, is I think that one thing that has changed to the better, and to end on an optimistic note, when we talked about Saudi Arabia or Bahrain or the GCC 5 years ago, people would go like, oh yeah, those oil-rich countries where you have, those fat sheikhs and their barrels of petrol in their backyards. That's how people viewed the GCC generally. And when you talked about the GCC, it was almost as if the populations there didn't exist. The only thing that existed were these monarchies that ran the show and that did business with the West and, went to vacation in places like London and Paris. But I think that has shifted. When you talk about the GCC today, people do think of Saudi Arabia as a country that commits human rights violations. And you do see comparisons made between Saudi Arabia and ISIS and the laws and the regulations that they actually implement on their own society. And we also saw this, of course, with the executions that happened in the beginning of this year. After 47 people were executed by the Saudi government. And so that is a positive change. The fact that there is a shifting discourse when it comes to talking about the GCC and when it comes to talking about the region in general, I think that is something very positive. Unfortunately, we're not necessarily seeing it in the diplomatic circles, but I think it always starts with populations in different countries starting to understand the way things are and the way that the situation is in those different countries, because at the end of the day, that is what creates discourse and rhetoric. And when you have people like Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton and Trump and all these other people going around for debates, these are questions that need to be posed and asked. Hopefully by the people who are asking the questions as the debate goes on, but also by people in the crowd. We'd love to see people actually come up and ask people in a debate, presidential candidates, what would you do about Saudi Arabia, who is executing people and crucifying people and committing war crimes in places like Yemen? So I think in that sense, that is something that I am optimistic about. I think people are smarter when it comes to the GCC countries. But we need to start seeing that in the diplomatic circles for it to actually make a difference in regards to foreign policy and human rights in general. Thank you.
To its shame, the Obama administration is in solid support of the tyrant king of Bahrain. It continues to station the U.S. Fifth Fleet in Bahrain. More on this in a future program. This has been Stanley Heller for The Struggle.